The Starlight Within, Jonathan Bailey's journey from Wallingford to the world prologue, the question that changes everything. What does it mean to truly become yourself? In the hushed corridor of a London theatre, between the crescendo of applause and the dimming of stage lights, a young man stands before a mirror. His costume still carries the weight of another's story, another's skin. But tonight, for the first time, he recognizes the face staring back at him, not the character he portrayed, but the person he's been too frightened to acknowledge. This is not where our story begins, but it is where everything transforms. The real beginning lies much earlier, in a verdant corner of England where ambitions were measured in simpler currencies, and where a small boy would dare to dream impossibly large dreams. The English countryside possessed a peculiar magic in those days, a tapestry woven from morning mist clinging to rolling hills, ancient church bells marking the passage of unhurried time, and secrets whispered through hedgerows that had witnessed centuries unfold. In the quaint market town of Wallingford, where the Thames meandered lazily past medieval ruins and honey-colored cottages, life maintained a rhythm unchanged by the frenetic pulse of the approaching millennium. Jonathan Stewart Bailey entered this world on April 25, 1988, to Carol, an audiologist devoted to restoring the symphony of sound to those who'd lost it, and Stuart Bailey, the managing director of Rouse Honey, a man whose work ethic would become legendary within his household. Young Jonathan grew up in the neighboring villages of Benson and Brightwell-cum-Sotwell, surrounded by three older sisters whose presence would shape him in ways he wouldn't fully comprehend until much later. It was a cooperative of four brilliant women and a dad who has an incredible work ethic, Jonathan would later reflect, his voice carrying the warmth of treasured memories. In that household, there was never silence, only laughter cascading down staircases, impromptu performances in the sitting room, and the constant hum of feminine energy that both challenged and nurtured the only boy among them. At 5 years old, Jonathan Bailey was unremarkable to the casual observer, a slender child with an excess of energy and eyes that seemed perpetually alight with curiosity. But those who truly watched noticed something extraordinary. The boy couldn't simply walk through life, he had to perform it. Every mundane moment became theater. Breakfast transformed into a dramatic tableau. The journey to school metamorphosed into an epic adventure narrated with sweeping gestures and borrowed accents from films he'd glimpsed on television. His sisters would roll their eyes, but their smiles betrayed their affection. His parents exchanged knowing glances across the dinner table, recognizing something nascent yet undeniable taking root within their son. The pivotal moment arrived when Jonathan's grandmother took him to see a production of Oliver. In London. They traveled from Oxfordshire on a train that seemed to Jonathan to be carrying them towards something momentous, though he couldn't articulate what. His grandmother, a woman of elegant bearing and sharp wit, held his small hand as they navigated the crowded streets of the West End, where theaters stood like grand sentinels guarding the mysteries within. When the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, 5-year-old Jonathan experienced a revelation that would architect his entire existence. He watched, transfixed, as ordinary humans transformed into extraordinary beings. They sang with voices that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond the mortal realm. They moved with purpose and passion, their bodies becoming instruments of storytelling. The stage itself appeared to be a portal to infinite possibilities, a space where poverty and wealth, sorrow and joy, life and death all danced together in glorious communion. Jonathan's small fingers gripped the armrests of his seat. His breathing grew shallow, his heart thundered against his ribs like something wild trying to break free. When young Oliver raised his empty bowl and uttered those immortal words, "Please, sir, I want some more," tears streamed down Jonathan's cheeks, though he couldn't explain why. On the train home, as the London skyline receded into darkness and Oxfordshire's familiar contours emerged, Jonathan turned to his grandmother with a solemnity that belied his tender years. "I'm going to do that," he declared, his voice steady despite his youth. "I'm going to be on that stage." His grandmother smiled, but not with the indulgent amusement adults often bestow upon children's fanciful pronouncements. She recognized something genuine in his declaration, the spark of vocation that arrives unbidden and demands acknowledgement. "Then you shall," she replied simply. Neither of them knew, in that moment, how prophetic those words would prove. Jonathan attended dance club in Henley-on-Thames, where he discovered that his body could be as expressive as his voice. Ballet, tap, jazz. Each discipline revealed new possibilities for communication beyond mere words. While other boys his age played football in muddy fields or collected trading cards, Jonathan pirouetted across wooden floors, his movements speaking a language that felt more authentic than anything he could articulate verbally. His first official performance came in a primary school production of Noah's Ark, where he was cast not as Noah, not as any of the animals, but as a raindrop. Another child might have felt diminished by such a minor role. Jonathan embraced it with the fervor of a leading man. He researched raindrop physics, studied videos of precipitation, and delivered a performance so committed that parents in the audience laughed with genuine delight rather than polite obligation. His primary school teacher, Mrs. Pemberton, pulled Carol aside after the performance. "Your son has something special," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He doesn't just perform, he inhabits. He transforms. That's not something you can teach." Carol Bailey nodded, pride and trepidation warring within her. She recognized that her son's gift might lead him away from the comfortable confines of Oxfordshire, toward a world both exhilarating and treacherous. At 7 years old, through his dance club connections, Jonathan auditioned for the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of A Christmas Carol at the Barbican Theatre in London. The audition process was rigorous, designed to identify not just talent but the rare combination of discipline, imagination, and resilience required for professional performance. Jonathan stood in a vast rehearsal room, one small boy among dozens of hopefuls. The casting directors sat behind a long table, their faces professionally neutral as child after child performed their prepared pieces. Some children were technically proficient, hitting every mark with mechanical precision. Others possessed raw charisma but lacked technical foundation. When Jonathan's turn arrived, something extraordinary occurred. He sang "Where Is Love?" from Oliver, the very show that had ignited his passion 2 years earlier. But he didn't merely sing it, he channeled every ounce of longing, confusion, and hope that the orphan Oliver must have felt. His young voice, still treble and unbroken, carried an emotional authenticity that transcended technical perfection. The casting directors leaned forward. Assistants stopped shuffling papers. In that moment, Jonathan Bailey wasn't a 7-year-old boy from Oxfordshire, he was Oliver Twist, and everyone in that room was transported to Victorian London, feeling the cold, the hunger, and the desperate yearning for connection that defined Dickens's protagonist. When he finished, silence filled the audition room for 3 heartbeats. Then one of the directors scribbled something on her notepad and looked up with an expression that Jonathan's mother, watching from the back of the room, immediately recognized: discovery. Jonathan was cast in alternating roles as Tiny Tim and young Scrooge in the Royal Shakespeare Company's production. At 7 years old, he would share stages with actors whose names appeared in theater history books. He would learn from directors whose interpretations of Shakespeare and Dickens were studied in universities worldwide. The boy from Wallingford had stepped through the looking glass. At 8 years old, Jonathan Bailey found himself cast as Gavroche in the West End production of Les Miserables at the Palace Theatre. If you've never witnessed Les Miserables, that monumental musical that has made audiences weep for decades, then understand this: Gavroche is not merely a role. He is the beating heart of revolution, a street urchin whose courage exceeds his years, whose death serves as one of theatre's most devastating moments. The Palace Theatre, with its ornate Victorian architecture and plush crimson seats, became Jonathan's second home. While his former classmates were learning multiplication tables and playing tag during recess, Jonathan was mastering the intricate choreography of barricade scenes, learning to project his voice to the theatre's upper balconies, and absorbing the craft of seasoned performers who had been honing their art since before he was born. Every evening at 7:30, the overture would begin. Jonathan would stand in the wings, his costume deliberately dirted to suggest Parisian poverty, his heart hammering with that intoxicating mixture of terror and exhilaration that never quite fades, no matter how many performances you've delivered. The stage manager would give the cue. The lights would shift. And Jonathan Bailey would cease to exist, replaced entirely by a scrappy French child who believed in liberty, equality, and fraternity with every fiber of his being. But this extraordinary opportunity carried a price that few outsiders could comprehend. While his peers experienced the ordinary rhythms of childhood, lazy summer afternoons, unstructured play, the luxury of boredom, Jonathan's schedule resembled that of a corporate executive. Morning tutoring sessions to keep pace with his educational requirements. Afternoon rehearsals. Evening performances. The cycle repeated 6 days a week, with Sundays reserved for rest that never quite felt adequate. There were moments when the facade would crack. Standing in the wings one evening, watching other children play in the square visible through the theater's back entrance, Jonathan felt something fracture within him. Not regret, exactly, but a keen awareness of what he was sacrificing. Birthday parties he couldn't attend. School friendships that withered from neglect. The simple privilege of being unexceptional. His mother found him that evening, sitting alone in his dressing room after the performance, still in costume, staring at his reflection with an expression far too contemplative for an 8-year-old. "Do you want to stop?" she asked gently, kneeling beside his chair. Jonathan considered the question seriously. The honest answer was complex yes and no, simultaneously, a paradox he lacked the vocabulary to articulate. "No," he finally said. "Because when I'm out there," he gestured toward the stage, "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Even when I'm tired. Even when I miss my friends. When I'm on that stage, I'm home." Carol Bailey blinked back tears and embraced her son, understanding with a mother's intuition that she was witnessing both the birth of an artist and the end of an ordinary childhood. Jonathan attended Benson Primary School, then the Oratory School, before earning a music scholarship to Magdalen College School in Oxford, where he played piano and clarinet. His musical education proved invaluable, understanding music theory, being able to sight-read scores, and possessing the discipline required for daily instrumental practice all enhanced his theatrical abilities in ways that would become apparent only years later. But straddling two worlds, the demanding rigors of performance and the social complexities of adolescence, took its toll. At Magdalen College School, Jonathan was simultaneously celebrated and othered. His theatrical accomplishments made him interesting to some classmates, strange to others. Teenage boys can be casually cruel, and Jonathan learned to navigate the delicate balance between embracing his difference and not drawing so much attention that he became a target. He developed protective mechanisms. Self-deprecating humor that made his achievements seem less threatening. An ability to code switch between the theatrical Jonathan and the schoolboy Jonathan. Skills that would serve him well in his professional life but also taught him the exhausting art of fragmentation, being different versions of yourself depending on the audience. As Jonathan progressed through adolescence, another, more profound question began to surface, one that had nothing to do with theater and everything to do with identity. He would later describe his realization about his sexuality as a gradual realization, acknowledging that other people understood my sexuality before I was even aware of it. But during those teenage years at Magdalen College, the question remained largely unformed, hovering at the edges of consciousness like a melody you can't quite place. There were small moments that, in retrospect, carried enormous significance. The way his attention lingered on certain boys in the changing room. The disconnect he felt when other boys discussed girls with that particular heated teenage intensity. The sense that he was performing heterosexuality as convincingly as he performed theatrical roles, except this performance never quite felt natural. Jonathan even dated a girl for a couple of years during this period. She was kind, intelligent, genuinely fond of him. And he tried, Lord, how he tried, to feel what he was supposed to feel. To experience the passion and desire that seemed to come so naturally to his peers. But it was, ultimately, another performance. A role he was playing for an audience that included himself. One evening after a particularly frustrating interaction with his girlfriend, Jonathan found himself alone in the Magdalen College chapel. The ancient space, with its soaring Gothic arches and filtered light through stained glass, offered a sanctuary where he could finally stop performing. "What's wrong with me?" he whispered to the empty pews, to God, or the universe, or simply to the echo of his own confusion. The chapel, as always, offered no answers. Only silence. And sometimes, silence is the most profound answer of all, the acknowledgement that some questions can only be resolved through time, courage, and the willingness to face truths that terrify us. At 15, Jonathan secured a talent agent, and the professional opportunities began multiplying. Television roles. Theater productions. The path toward a serious acting career was becoming increasingly clear and concrete. When university acceptance letters arrived, Jonathan faced a choice that would define his trajectory. He had been offered places at prestigious institutions, the conventional path for someone of his academic ability. But he also had something else, a burgeoning career that didn't require a degree, only talent, dedication, and courage. After agonizing consideration, he declined the university offers. "I've never gone in as the overdog," he would later reflect, "and that's liberating, and I don't want that to ever change. I just want to allow my own experiences to come through." This decision, to trust his instincts, to choose the unconventional path, would become a defining pattern in Jonathan's life. Again and again, he would face crossroads where the safe choice beckoned alongside the authentic one. And again, he would choose authenticity, even when it terrified him. The romantic narrative of show business suggests a linear trajectory. Talent plus hard married accumulated the traditional markers of adult success while Jonathan still slept on a mattress on the floor and counted coins for the tube fare. But he didn't quit. Couldn't quit, really. Because despite the hardship, despite the uncertainty, despite every rational reason to choose stability over passion, the stage still called to him with a voice more compelling than security ever could be. In 2013, Jonathan's persistence finally paid off when he was cast as Oliver "Ollie" Stevens in the crime drama Broadchurch, alongside David Tennant and Olivia Colman. The show became a cultural phenomenon, a gripping murder mystery that held the nation in suspense and demonstrated that British television drama could compete with any production in the world. Jonathan played a young journalist trying to cover the murder of a child in his small coastal town, a role that required him to convey ambition, moral complexity, and the corrupting influence of media attention on tragedy. For the first time, mainstream audiences saw him not as a talented child actor who'd grown up, but as a serious adult performer capable of nuance and depth. The role of Ollie Stevens was morally ambiguous in ways that fascinated Jonathan. Ollie wasn't a villain, but he wasn't quite a hero either. He was a young man whose career ambitions caused him to make choices that hurt people he cared about, a reminder that good people are capable of causing harm when they prioritize personal advancement over ethical considerations. Playing Ollie forced Jonathan to examine uncomfortable questions about ambition, complicity, and the price we pay for success. These were not abstract philosophical inquiries but intensely personal investigations that mirrored his own journey through the entertainment industry. While building his television profile, Jonathan never abandoned theater. In 2013, he was cast by Nicholas Hytner as Cassio in a production of Othello at the National Theatre's Olivier stage. Working at the National, one of Britain's most prestigious theatrical institutions, represented a homecoming of sorts, a return to the medium that had first captured his imagination. Othello, Shakespeare's devastating examination of jealousy, race, and manipulation, provided Jonathan with a masterclass in classical performance. Playing Cassio, the lieutenant whose innocent friendship with Desdemona becomes weaponized by Iago, required Jonathan to convey integrity and naivety simultaneously, to be both sympathetic and frustratingly blind to the machinations surrounding him. But more significantly, this production marked a personal milestone. It was during Othello rehearsals that Jonathan, for the first time, spoke about his sexuality in a professional rehearsal room, which felt to me a huge step. Making that decision before you go in, he later recalled. The sky didn't fall. His colleagues didn't recoil. If anything, acknowledging this fundamental aspect of his identity enhanced his work, allowing him to access emotional authenticity that had been slightly muted when he was constantly self-monitoring. This moment, speaking his truth in a rehearsal room, might seem small to outsiders. But for Jonathan, it was seismic. It was the first crack in a facade he'd been maintaining for years, the first indication that perhaps he didn't have to choose between his career and his authentic self. In 2016, Jonathan starred in The Last 5 Years at the Other Palace, opposite Samantha Barks. Jason Robert Brown's intimate musical tells the story of a relationship from two perspectives, one moving forward in time, one moving backward, creating a heartbreaking portrait of love's beginning and ending occurring simultaneously. The production was small, scrappy, performed in a venue that seated hundreds rather than thousands. But for those who witnessed it, Jonathan's performance was revelatory. His rendition of If I Didn't Believe in You, a song in which a husband expresses both love and frustration with his wife's career struggles, showcased not just his considerable vocal abilities but his capacity for emotional vulnerability. There's a moment in that song where the character must balance support with resentment, love with exasperation, commitment with doubt. Jonathan inhabited that impossible emotional space with such honesty that audiences held their breath, recognizing something true and uncomfortable about the compromises and competitions that exist even in loving relationships. But the role that would define this phase of his career came in 2018, when he joined the West End production of Stephen Sondheim's Company, directed by Marianne Elliott. Company, Sondheim's sophisticated examination of marriage, relationships, and connection in modern life, was being presented with a revolutionary gender-swapped concept. The traditionally male protagonist Bobby became a woman, and several other roles were reimagined to create a contemporary conversation about love and commitment. Jonathan originated the role of Jamie, originally written as Amy, a female character, creating the show's first same-sex couple. This gender-swapped casting wasn't mere gimmickry, it transformed the musical's themes, making visible relationships and anxieties that had been absent from Sondheim's original vision. Jonathan's performance of Getting Married Today, Sondheim's notoriously difficult patter song about wedding day anxiety, became legendary. According to The Times, he received an ovation every night after completing the infamous rat-tat-tat, mile-a-minute technical feat. If you're unfamiliar with Getting Married Today, imagine trying to deliver coherent lyrics at breakneck speed while simultaneously conveying escalating panic, all while maintaining perfect pitch and rhythm. It's a song that has defeated many talented performers. Sondheim wrote it specifically to be nearly impossible, a musical representation of psychological breakdown. Jonathan didn't just perform the song, he owned it completely. His interpretation was both technically flawless and emotionally devastating. Audiences watched a man disintegrating in real time, his fears about commitment, about being truly known by another person, about the terrifying vulnerability of love laid utterly bare. Variety described his lightning-fast, show-stopping rendition of the song became a must-see West End event. People who had already seen Company multiple times returned specifically to watch Jonathan's performance. Critics, notoriously difficult to impress, ran out of superlatives. In 2019, Jonathan won the Laurence Olivier Award for Best Actor in a Supporting Role in a Musical, Britain's highest theatrical honor. The Olivier Awards ceremony, held at the Royal Albert Hall, is British theatre's equivalent of the Oscars, an evening where the industry's most accomplished artists gather to celebrate excellence. When Jonathan's name was called, he made his way to the stage with a mixture of disbelief and profound emotion. Standing before his peers, holding the award that represented not just this performance but decades of dedication, he delivered an acceptance speech that revealed both his artistry and his humanity. Addressing the row over LGBT-inclusive education that was roiling English schools at the time, he said he was proud the show had included a celebratory snapshot of gay love. LGBT people are not that different, he continued. We're just as anxious and just as flawed and just as desperate to fall in love as everyone else. The applause that followed was thunderous, not just for his performance, but for his courage in using this platform to advocate for visibility and acceptance at a moment when both were under assault. Jonathan had privately come out to friends and family in his early 20s, but didn't comment on his sexuality publicly until 2018. The decision to speak openly about being gay was not made lightly. In conversations with Attitude magazine, Jonathan revealed that some of the most conservative advice about staying closeted came from gay men within the industry itself. "Oh, no, you can't come out. You shouldn't really do that," they would say, advice born not from malice but from their own experiences in an industry that has historically punished visibility. Casting directors had even called his agent to essentially warn him that acknowledging his sexuality might limit his opportunities. The subtext was clear: the industry would employ gay actors, but preferred they remain ambiguous about their personal lives, available to be marketed as heterosexual leading men. For years, Jonathan had navigated this impossible tension. He wasn't closeted in his personal life, his friends and family knew and loved him exactly as he was. But he wasn't public either, operating in a gray area that felt neither honest nor protective. The breaking point came during pilot season, when an actor friend, himself gay, offered what he considered pragmatic advice: "There's two things we don't want to know, if you're an alcoholic or if you're gay." Those words haunted Jonathan. They represented everything wrong with an industry that would rather you destroy yourself with addiction or live a lie than simply be honest about whom you loved. Finally, Jonathan reached a point where he thought, "Fuck this. I'd much prefer to hold my boyfriend's hand in public or be able to put my own face picture on Tinder and not be so concerned about that than getting apart." Coming out publicly didn't involve a grand announcement or magazine cover. It was simply a matter of no longer self-censoring, of speaking honestly in interviews, of refusing to play the game of strategic ambiguity that the industry preferred. As he told Sir Ian McKellen in a candid conversation for Attitude magazine, "I hadn't necessarily hidden it, but I've never been not honest about it. It's just there had never been a need to talk about it until there was, until silence itself became its own form of dishonesty." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Younger actors reached out to thank him. LGBTQ+ youth sent messages describing how his visibility gave them hope. His career didn't implode; if anything, it strengthened, as casting directors saw someone comfortable in his own skin, capable of bringing that same authenticity to every role. But perhaps more importantly, Jonathan felt lighter. The exhausting performance of straightness, a role he'd been playing since adolescence, could finally end. The energy he'd been spending on self-monitoring and code-switching could be redirected toward his actual craft. "Coming out was a moment of relief," he later said, "and actually made me a better actor because staying in the closet had taken a toll on my health." If there was a single before and after moment in Jonathan Bailey's career, it was December 25, 2020, when Netflix released Bridgerton. The timing was peculiar: Christmas Day during a global pandemic, when much of the world was locked down, desperate for escapism. Bridgerton delivered exactly that, a sumptuous Regency romance produced by Shonda Rhimes, featuring diverse casting, lavish costumes, and storylines that blended period authenticity with contemporary sensibilities. Jonathan played Anthony Bridgerton, the 9th Viscount Bridgerton, the eldest son of the family, burdened with responsibility, desperate to maintain control. In Season 1, Anthony was essentially a supporting character, but he made an impression, a man whose stern exterior masked profound grief and fear. But it was Season 2, released in March 2022, that transformed Jonathan Bailey from respected actor to global phenomenon. Season 2 focused on Anthony's romance with Kate Sharma, played with fierce intelligence by Simone Ashley. Their relationship, marked by verbal sparring, intense chemistry, and mutual resistance to vulnerability, captivated audiences worldwide. There were moments in that season that became cultural touchstones. Anthony emerging from the lake in a wet shirt, a deliberate homage to Colin Firth's iconic Mr. Darcy moment. The Pall Mall game, where flirtation and competition became indistinguishable. The conservatory scene, where years of repression finally exploded into passionate acknowledgement. One morning, Jonathan woke to discover his fame had fundamentally shifted. "I had the radio set for my alarm, and one morning it went off with, 'Here's the news at 7. But just before we go, can we talk about Jonathan Bailey?' I was like, 'Where is my journal? Is this real?' It was wild. Suddenly, Jonathan couldn't walk through London without being recognized. Social media exploded with fan accounts dedicated to Anthony Bridgerton. His follower count skyrocketed. Journalists wanted interviews. Fashion brands wanted partnerships. This level of fame, the kind that transforms you into public property, that makes your face recognizable to millions who know nothing about your actual life, is disorienting even when you've spent your entire life in performance. Jonathan handled his newfound celebrity with remarkable grace, but he was candid about its challenges. Being recognized everywhere. Having your appearance dissected by strangers. losing the anonymity that allows for unguarded moments. As Douglas Greenwood of GQ observed, dispositionally, he's one of those actors who'd rather work than be famous. Jonathan was genuinely more interested in the craft than the celebrity, a distinction that's easy to claim but harder to embody. He set boundaries, kept his romantic relationships private, chose roles based on artistic merit rather than commercial appeal, continued doing theater even when film and television offered more money and exposure. "My private life isn't secret, it's just private," he explained to interviewers who pressed for details about his personal relationships. It was a distinction many struggle to understand in an era where celebrities are expected to offer constant access to their inner lives. In 2023, Jonathan starred opposite Matt Bomer in Showtime's Fellow Travelers, a limited series that follows two men whose romance spans decades of American LGBTQ+ history. The show was ambitious in scope and unflinching in its depiction of both the beauty and brutality of queer life from the 1950s through the 1980s. Jonathan played Tim Laughlin, a young congressional aide whose idealistic worldview is repeatedly shattered by political persecution, social stigma, and the AIDS crisis. The Washington Post called Jonathan's performance sensational. Critics who had admired his work in Bridgerton suddenly recognized the full range of his capabilities, his capacity for vulnerability, for portraying someone whose fundamental goodness makes him perpetually susceptible to hurt. Ben Travers of IndieWire noted, "Bailey is an exposed nerve. Tim loses his hero, his faith, and his companion, most more than once. The cold, hard world just keeps smacking him in the face, but the same starry-eyed hope that hurts Tim is also what saves him." The physical and emotional demands of Fellow Travelers were extraordinary. Scenes depicting Tim's deterioration during the AIDS crisis required Jonathan to transform his body, to embody illness and approaching death with devastating authenticity. Sex scenes between Tim and Hawk were explicit but never gratuitous. Each intimate moment served the story, revealing character and emotional evolution. In an interview on The Jess Cagle Show, Jonathan explained the importance of these depictions. "Historically, gay men have had a really bad time of being written off as being animalistic in the way that they meet and have sex with each other, but I'm hoping the show will allow people to understand that these cottaging and the toilet, they're the only places that they could go to meet these people." In January 2024, Jonathan won the Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Supporting Actor in a Limited Series. His acceptance speech became one of the evening's most memorable moments. "Anyone who has watched Fellow Travelers, you will know that Matt Bomer is extraordinary," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But what you might not know is how much care, compassion, and collaboration went into telling this story." He paused, gathering himself. "This show is for everyone who has ever had to hide who they are. For everyone who has lost someone to prejudice, to disease, to a world that wasn't ready to see them. We made this for you." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 2 minutes. If Fellow Travelers showcased Jonathan's dramatic range, his next project would reveal another dimension entirely: his musical theater prowess translated to film. In November 2024, Universal Pictures released Wicked, the long-anticipated cinematic adaptation of the Broadway phenomenon. Jonathan was cast as Fiyero Tigelaar, the charismatic prince who finds himself caught between two extraordinary witches, Elphaba and Glinda, played by Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande. Fiyero is a deceptively complex role. On the surface, he's the archetypal charming prince, handsome, carefree, popular. But beneath that carefully constructed facade lies someone desperately seeking authenticity in a world that rewards superficiality. His signature song, Dancing Through Life, is ostensibly about hedonism but actually about existential avoidance, a young man so afraid of confronting life's genuine questions that he literally dances around them. Jonathan understood Fiyero's psychology intimately. After all, hadn't he spent years performing different versions of himself, learning to navigate spaces by presenting whatever persona seemed safest? Director John M. Chu recognized this depth in Jonathan's audition. "When Jonathan sang Dancing Through Life, I saw someone who understood that the song is actually about sadness," Chu said in a press junket interview. "He brought melancholy to a character that could have been one-dimensional. That's the mark of a truly exceptional actor." The production was monumental in scale. The sets were practical constructions, actual buildings, not green screens. The choreography required months of preparation. And the vocal demands were extraordinary, requiring Jonathan to sing Stephen Schwartz's complex musical arrangements while performing intricate choreography. Working alongside Cynthia Erivo, a powerhouse vocalist and actress, pushed Jonathan to new heights. Their duet, As Long as You're Mine, became one of the film's most anticipated moments, a passionate declaration of love that occurs in the shadow of impending tragedy. When Wicked premiered at the State Theatre in Sydney on November 3, 2024, the response was rapturous. Critics praised the film's ambition, its visual splendor, and its performances. Variety's review specifically highlighted Jonathan Bailey brings unexpected depth to Fiyero, transforming what could have been a thankless love interest role into a genuine character journey. The film became a cultural phenomenon, grossing hundreds of millions worldwide and introducing Jonathan to audiences who had somehow missed Bridgerton and Fellow Travelers. Suddenly, he wasn't just a television star or theater actor, he was a bona fide movie star. But even as his career reached stratospheric heights, Jonathan remained committed to activism and community support. He became increasingly involved with the Shameless Fund, a charity that works toward ending bullying in schools and creating safer environments for LGBTQ+ youth. The organization's name, Shameless, carried particular resonance for Jonathan. Shame had been the invisible antagonist of his own journey, the voice whispering that his identity was something to hide, to minimize, to apologize for. The idea that young people might grow up without carrying that burden felt revolutionary. He spoke at schools, participated in fundraising campaigns, and used his platform to amplify the voices of LGBTQ+ youth who were still finding their own. In one particularly moving appearance at a London secondary school, a 17-year-old student asked Jonathan what he wished someone had told him when he was figuring out his identity. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I wish someone had told me that the thing I was most afraid of, being truly seen, would turn out to be the thing that saved me," he said. "I spent so much energy hiding, thinking that if people knew the real me, I'd lose everything. But the opposite happened. When I finally stopped hiding, I found myself. And that's when my real life began." The student's eyes filled with tears. After the assembly, he approached Jonathan privately. "I'm not ready yet," the boy said, "to tell everyone. But hearing you say that, it makes me think maybe someday I will be." "Take all the time you need," Jonathan replied. "There's no timeline for becoming yourself. Just know that when you're ready, the world is more welcoming than you might think. And the people who matter will still be there." These moments, far from cameras and red carpets, represented what Jonathan considered his most important work. Awards and accolades were gratifying, but the opportunity to impact someone's journey toward self-acceptance felt genuinely meaningful. Jurassic World, Dominion and Hollywood's embrace. In 2022, Jonathan had appeared in Jurassic World, Dominion, the concluding chapter of the rebooted dinosaur franchise. His role as Soyona Santos, a smuggler dealing in prehistoric black market goods, was smaller than his other recent work, but it demonstrated his versatility and willingness to embrace pure entertainment alongside more serious dramatic projects. Working on a massive Hollywood blockbuster presented different challenges than intimate character studies or theatrical productions. The scale was enormous: hundreds of crew members, cutting-edge visual effects, stunts coordinated with military precision. His scenes involved interaction with creatures that wouldn't be added until post-production, requiring him to direct his reactions toward tennis balls and imagination. But what struck Jonathan most was the efficiency. In theater, you have weeks of rehearsal to develop character and chemistry. On massive film productions, you might meet your scene partners the day before filming and be expected to generate immediate, convincing dynamics. "It's a different kind of acting," he explained in an interview with Empire magazine. "Less about sustained character development and more about creating authentic moments very quickly. Both are valid, both are challenging. They just exercise different muscles." In 2023, Jonathan made a guest appearance in the second season of Heartstopper, the beloved Netflix series about queer teenage romance adapted from Alice Oseman's graphic novels. He played Jack Maddox, an ornery lecturer at a university fair, in a brief but memorable scene. The role was small, essentially a cameo, but Jonathan insisted on taking it because of what the show represented. Heartstopper offered something that hadn't existed when he was a teenager, a mainstream, widely accessible story about young queer people experiencing joy, friendship, and love without tragedy or trauma as the defining narrative. When I was growing up, the queer stories available were predominantly about suffering, he reflected in an interview with Attitude magazine. Coming out stories, AIDS stories, hate crime stories. All important, all valid. But there was this absence of just normalcy. Of queer kids being kids, navigating first love and friendship in school with the same complexity but without the assumption that being queer automatically meant your story would end badly. Working with the young cast of Heartstopper, Kit Connor, Joe Locke, and others reminded Jonathan of his own teenage years, but also highlighted how much had changed. These young actors were growing up in an environment where being out wasn't career suicide, where playing queer characters wasn't considered limiting, where authenticity was increasingly valued over strategic ambiguity. "They give me hope," he said about the Heartstopper cast. "Not just for the industry, but for the world." Despite his success, Jonathan remained remarkably grounded. He continued living in London rather than relocating to Los Angeles. He took the tube. He shopped at ordinary supermarkets. He maintained friendships that predated his fame. In interviews, he was disarmingly honest about the challenges of balancing career ambition with personal well-being. The pressure to capitalize on his Bridgerton moment. The anxiety about being typecast. The exhaustion that comes from constant promotion and public appearance. "There's this assumption that once you make it, everything becomes easy," he told The Guardian. But success brings its own complications. Different problems, certainly, than struggling to pay rent. But still problems. The pressure to maintain visibility, to make smart career choices, to never seem ungrateful for opportunities. It's a different kind of stress. He was also candid about the mental health challenges that accompany careers in the arts. The rejection that never stops stinging. The imposter syndrome that whispers you don't deserve your success. The difficulty of finding genuine connection when fame makes every interaction potentially transactional. Jonathan worked with a therapist regularly, something he discussed openly, helping to destigmatize mental health care for men, particularly men in creative industries where vulnerability is often perceived as weakness. "Therapy isn't a sign that something's wrong," he emphasized. "It's maintenance. Like going to the gym, but for your mental health." Everyone benefits from having an objective person help them process their experiences and patterns. Acting philosophy. In various interviews over the years, Jonathan articulated a thoughtful philosophy about acting that revealed both his technical sophistication and his emotional intelligence. He was particularly interested in the concept of truth in performance, not realistic truth, but emotional truth. "Theater is inherently artificial," he explained to the stage. "People don't spontaneously burst into song in real life. But if the emotional truth is present, if the audience recognizes genuine human experience in what they're witnessing, then the artificiality becomes irrelevant." This distinction between realistic and truthful informed all his work. His performances in Bridgerton weren't historically accurate in any literal sense. The show deliberately blended contemporary sensibilities with period aesthetics. But Anthony Bridgerton's fear of vulnerability, his desperate attempts to control an uncontrollable world through rigid adherence to duty, those were emotionally truthful experiences that resonated regardless of the Regency setting. Similarly, in Fellow Travelers, the specific historical details mattered less than the universal experience of loving someone while the world insists your love is shameful, wrong, or dangerous. Despite his success in film and television, Jonathan repeatedly emphasized that theater remained his first love and primary artistic home. "Theater is where I learned everything," he said during his Olivier Award acceptance speech. "It's where you develop discipline, presence, the ability to sustain a character arc over 2.5 hours without the safety net of multiple takes. Film and television are wonderful, but theater keeps you honest. He noted that theater audiences are uniquely present. They've made the effort to attend, to sit in that specific space at that specific time. Their responses, their laughter, their tears, their silence, provide immediate feedback that shapes each performance. No two performances are ever identical in theater, he explained. You're responding to the audience's energy, to how your fellow actors are feeling that night, to 1,000 subtle variables. It's alive in a way that film can never be, because film is fixed. Once it's captured, it's permanent. Theater is ephemeral. It exists only in that moment, and then it's gone. This appreciation for theater's impermanence influenced his screen work as well. He approached each take with theatrical presence, treating it as a unique moment rather than one iteration among many that would be perfected in editing. Jonathan consistently emphasized collaboration over individual achievement. In interviews, he deflected credit, highlighting directors, fellow actors, writers, and crew members who contributed to successful projects. This wasn't false modesty but genuine appreciation for the communal nature of performance. Acting isn't a solo sport, he told Variety. Even if you're technically alone on stage or on screen, you're supported by dozens or hundreds of people whose work makes yours possible. The lighting designer who ensures you're beautifully lit. The costume designer who creates clothes that help you inhabit the character. The fellow actor who gives you something real to respond to. His collaborators consistently praised his generosity. Simone Ashley, his Bridgerton co-star, noted that Jonathan made sure I felt supported and safe during our intimate scenes, always checking in, always putting the work and the story first. Matt Bomer, from Fellow Travelers, described Jonathan as one of the most giving actors I've ever worked with. He doesn't just show up for his own scenes, he's there for yours, invested in your performance, offering genuine reaction and support. This generosity extended beyond his scene partners to everyone on set. Crew members shared stories of Jonathan learning their names, asking about their families, expressing genuine interest in their work. On the demanding Wicked shoot, he organized weekly gatherings where cast and crew could decompress together, creating community in what could have been an impersonal, industrial process. The complexity of visibility. As Jonathan's fame increased, so did public interest in his personal life, particularly his romantic relationships. The tension between his commitment to LGBTQ+ visibility and his desire for privacy created a nuanced position that many struggle to understand. He was out and proud, willing to discuss his sexuality in abstract terms and its impact on his career and self-understanding. But he declined to provide details about specific relationships, refusing to name partners or discuss the intimate details of his romantic life. Being out doesn't mean every aspect of your life becomes public property, he explained to GQ. I can be visible as a gay man in the industry, advocating for better representation and more diverse storytelling, while still maintaining boundaries around my private relationships. Some critics argued this position was inconsistent, that visibility required full transparency. But Jonathan maintained that the distinction was crucial. His sexuality was part of his public identity because it was relevant to the roles he played, the stories he wanted to tell, and the communities he represented. His specific romantic relationships were private because they belonged to him and his partners, not to public consumption. I don't owe anyone access to the person I love, he said firmly. That's where I draw the line. My professional life is public. My advocacy work is public. But my relationship is mine. This boundary setting was particularly important given the historical exploitation of queer relationships by media. Too often, LGBTQ+ celebrities' relationships were treated as curiosities, their intimacy positioned as more transgressive or interesting than equivalent heterosexual relationships. Jonathan was also acutely aware of the representational burden he carried, the reality that his visibility made him, by default, a representative of LGBTQ+ experience for audiences who might not know many, or any, openly queer people in their own lives. This was both an honor and an enormous pressure. "I'm just one person living one specific experience," he told The Advocate. "I'm a cisgender white man from a relatively privileged background. My experience of being gay is shaped by all those other identities. I can't represent all queer people, and I shouldn't be expected to." Yet he recognized that visibility mattered, particularly in an industry where queer actors were still fighting for the opportunity to play both queer and straight roles without being pigeonholed or limited by their sexuality. When he was cast as Fiyero in Wicked, a traditionally straight romantic lead, the casting generated discussion. Some celebrated it as evidence that openly gay actors could now play any role. Others questioned whether straight characters should be played by straight actors. Jonathan's position was clear: straight actors have played gay characters forever, often winning awards for it. "The idea that I shouldn't be allowed to play straight characters because I'm openly gay is absurd. Acting is about embodying experiences beyond your own. That's literally the job." Not all responses to Jonathan's openness were positive. He received homophobic comments on social media. Some fans of Bridgerton struggled with the cognitive dissonance of learning that the actor playing their romantic fantasy was gay. Industry insiders occasionally suggested, with varying degrees of subtlety, that being more ambiguous might expand his opportunities. Jonathan addressed these challenges with a combination of directness and humor. When asked about losing straight female fans who couldn't reconcile his sexuality with their attraction to his characters, he laughed. "If someone is so bothered by my sexuality that they can't enjoy my work, then they probably weren't the audience I'm most interested in reaching anyway," he said. "Besides, I'd argue that Anthony Bridgerton is Anthony Bridgerton regardless of who plays him. The character's sexuality exists independently of mine." He was more serious when discussing industry pressure to remain ambiguous. "The fact that people in the industry, gay people in the industry, still sometimes suggest that openness is career limiting tells you how much further we have to go," he said. "Every time I book a major role as an openly gay man, I'm proving that advice wrong. And that feels like meaningful work." 2025 Recognition and Reflection. In early 2025, People magazine named Jonathan Bailey as one of its Sexiest Men Alive, an honor that generated significant media attention and public discussion. The designation was simultaneously flattering and slightly absurd, Jonathan acknowledged with characteristic self-deprecation. "I'm deeply flattered, obviously," he told Jimmy Fallon during a Tonight Show appearance. "But also, has anyone seen me first thing in the morning? This is all smoke and mirrors, strategic lighting, and very talented stylists." Beyond the humor, though, Jonathan recognized the designation's significance. "When was the last time an openly gay man received this type of mainstream recognition as an object of desire rather than as a character role or comedic sidekick? Representation isn't just about seeing yourself in dramatic narratives," he reflected. "It's also about being seen as desirable, as aspirational, as sexy." For a long time, gay men in media were desexualized or hypersexualized but never just normally attractive. This feels like a small shift in that dynamic. True to form, he used the platform to redirect attention toward more substantive issues, discussing ongoing challenges facing LGBTQ+ youth, the importance of continued advocacy, and upcoming projects that excited him artistically. Jonathan's career showed no signs of slowing. He was attached to multiple high-profile projects across stage and screen, each offering different opportunities for artistic exploration. Wicked Part 2 was in post-production, promising to continue the story and showcase more of Fiyero's journey. Early buzz suggested the second film would be even more emotionally powerful than the first, with Jonathan's performance occupying a more central role. He was also in discussions about returning to theater, his constant anchor, with rumors of a potential West End or Broadway production that would allow him to originate a new role in a contemporary musical. And Bridgerton's fourth season was in development, with speculation about whether Anthony and Kate would return for significant appearances or brief cameos. While Jonathan remained tight-lipped about specifics, his obvious affection for the show and the character suggested he'd find ways to return to that world. In a reflective interview with The Times, conducted in a quiet London cafe far from the chaos of premieres and press junkets, Jonathan considered his journey with unusual candor. "I think about that 7-year-old boy auditioning for the Royal Shakespeare Company," he said, stirring his tea absently. "He was so certain, so unafraid. And then somewhere along the way, I became afraid. Afraid of being seen, of being judged, of losing opportunities if I was too honest about who I was." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Getting back to that fearlessness, to the certainty that 7-year-old had, that's been the real journey. Not the career success, as wonderful as that's been. But finding my way back to authenticity. To being as brave in my life as I am in my performances. When asked what advice he'd give to young actors starting out, particularly young queer actors navigating an industry that has historically demanded conformity, Jonathan's response was immediate. "Don't let anyone convince you that you need to hide to succeed. That might have been true once, but it's less true every day. And more importantly, the cost of hiding, the toll it takes on your mental health, your relationships, your actual work, is too high. You can't do your best work when you're spending half your energy pretending to be someone you're not." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "And here's the thing they don't tell you, the thing you're most afraid people will reject you for? That's often the thing that makes you most interesting, most unique, most valuable. Your difference is your strength. Not despite it, but because of it." In the summer of 2024, Jonathan returned to Wallingford for a quiet visit, no press, no fanfare, just a man revisiting the place where his story began. He walked through the town center, noting what had changed: new shops, renovated buildings, different faces, and what remained, the Thames still flowing, the church bells still marking time, the essential character of the place intact. He stopped by the small local theater where he'd attended his first productions as a child. The building was modest, nothing like the grand West End venues where he now worked, but it held a particular magic, the magic of beginnings, of first loves, of dreams taking shape. The theater manager, recognizing him despite his attempts to remain inconspicuous, invited him backstage. Jonathan accepted, finding himself in a cramped dressing room where local children were preparing for that evening's production of Matilda. They recognized him, of course they did. He was Anthony Bridgerton, and peppered him with questions. "How did you become an actor? Is it scary performing in front of so many people? Do you ever forget your lines?" Jonathan answered each question with genuine thoughtfulness, seeing his younger self reflected in their eager faces. One girl, perhaps 9 years old, asked the question that mattered most: "Did you always know you'd be famous?" Jonathan knelt down to her eye level. "I never thought about being famous," he said honestly. "I just knew that when I was performing, I felt like myself in a way I didn't feel anywhere else. I felt free. That's what I chased, not fame, but that feeling of freedom." The girl nodded seriously, processing this information. "I feel that way when I'm on stage," she said quietly. "Like I can be anyone. Like I can be brave." Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes. "Then keep chasing that feeling," he told her. "No matter what anyone tells you, no matter how hard it gets, keep chasing that feeling. Because that's your compass. That's how you'll find your way." Later, walking along the Thames as the sun set over Wallingford, Jonathan reflected on the circularity of his journey. He'd started in this small town, dreaming of stages beyond anything his environment suggested was possible. He'd achieved those dreams, exceeded them even, performing on some of the world's most prestigious stages and screens. And now, returning, he realized the essential truth: success wasn't about distance traveled or heights achieved. It was about remaining true to that initial spark, that 7-year-old certainty that he belonged on stage. Every role, every performance, every choice to be authentic rather than strategic, these were all acts of returning to that original truth. The journey outward was actually a journey inward, back to the self he'd always been before the world taught him to doubt. There's a Buddhist concept called beginner's mind, approaching each moment with openness and enthusiasm, regardless of experience. In Zen meditation, advanced practitioners aim to maintain the same fresh curiosity that novices bring to their first session. Jonathan Bailey, despite decades of performance, somehow maintains this quality. Watch him in interviews, even after hundreds of promotional conversations. He's genuinely present, actually listening, discovering new insights about his own work through the act of discussion. There's no autopilot, no rote responses polished through repetition. On stage or on screen, the same quality emerges. Whether it's his 100th performance of a role or his first, he brings complete presence, finding new details, new emotional shadings, new truths in material he's explored countless times before. This is perhaps his greatest gift, not his technical skill, though that's considerable, not his charisma, though that's undeniable, but his ability to remain genuinely engaged with his craft, to approach each project with the enthusiasm of someone just beginning rather than someone who has already arrived. At 37 years old, Jonathan Bailey is simultaneously an established star and an artist still defining his legacy. The roles that will ultimately define his career may not have been written yet. The performances that will be studied by future generations of actors might still be ahead of him. But certain things are already clear. He will be remembered as someone who helped expand what was possible for openly LGBTQ+ actors in mainstream entertainment. Not the first, certainly, he stands on the shoulders of Ian McKellen, Jodie Foster, Neil Patrick Harris, and countless others who paved the way. But part of a crucial generation that normalized openness, that proved visibility didn't preclude versatility. He will be remembered for bringing nuance and depth to roles that could have been superficial. Anthony Bridgerton could have been a typical brooding romantic lead. Jonathan made him complicated, wounded, genuinely transformative across the arc of his story. Fiyero could have been pure charm. Jonathan gave him melancholy. Tim Laughlin could have been a victim. Jonathan made him a survivor. But perhaps most importantly, he will be remembered for insisting that authenticity and success aren't mutually exclusive. That you don't have to choose between career and self. That the very things that make you different, that make you doubt your place in an industry built on conformity, might actually be your greatest strengths.